Hi, everyone. That's me, Tom Yelm. I'm here to welcome you to NPR. How many of you have not been here before? Whoa, okay. Well, welcome. This is great. This afternoon, I was in a meeting with my boss, and we were talking about 2017, which is going to be a red letter year for us because it's the 50th anniversary of the founding of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, which, as you probably know, is the government fund or wing that supports NPR, our member stations, as well as PBS. And so it's, a significant birthday in our history. And with that in mind, we've been taking a long view of who we are, where we came from, where we're going. And I'll say the public in public radio is something that we've taken very seriously and has many different dimensions to it. So obviously we're a public broadcaster. We exist based on public funding. But we're not just a broadcaster. We're not just a mouthpiece. We're also, sorry about this. That's my boss. Put that down. We're also a convener. So conversations like this, gatherings like this of talented people, engaged people, it's very much what we're about. So this is mission appropriate, as well as just a fun gathering. So we've been looking forward to this night, me especially. I know one of the themes of tonight's conversation has to do with career paths and serendipity and how do you get from one place to another. And so Liz asked me to think about my own career path. I wouldn't necessarily recommend it, but I'll just share where I came from and how I got here. So growing up, as I was starting out in life, I wanted to be a writer, and I was a good writer, but I was also interested in acting, and I was a fair actor. But I was interested in photography, and I was interested in performance. So I found myself after college moving to Los Angeles, and I went to film school. So I got into the film industry. And I quickly found out that it wasn't really for me. So I was kind of on the fringes of Hollywood doing a little bit of writing, a little bit of acting, a little bit of editing, producing, etc. But then the mid-90s happened, and with it came digital media, or interactive media, as it was then known. And I was, right place, right time, good fortune of being invited to the first meeting of NBC's first interactive media group. And NBC at the time was the #1 network. It was the era of Friends and ER, and it was, to its credit, taking a long view of itself as a media company. So it was one of the first networks to be thinking in terms of new programming for new platforms for new audiences. And that was 20 years ago, and here I am. So I've taken a long and winding road. I spent many years with NBC. Worked for a couple startups in Hollywood, worked at AOL, because everybody has to work at AOL at some point in their career, back to NBC. And then I came here, and I must say, I think a lot of people who work in public radio, however I got here, however long it took, it was like coming home. I grew up listening to public radio. The values, the quality, the credibility of public radio was just something I'd always imprinted on. And so, my career has been an adventure, one adventuresome chapter after another. But for me, I just feel blessed to be here because at the end of the adventurous road, you come home to a place like this. And so I feel very fortunate. And again, very fortunate to be here for meetings like this. So welcome, and look forward to the conversation. Thanks.
Good evening. My name is Mariana Matulo, and it's a distinct honor and pleasure and joy to be here tonight with all of you. I am the co-founder and vice president of a department at our Central College of Design in Pasadena, California, called Designmatters, that really looks at these intersections of design practice, design education, and social change and social innovation. And I've had the opportunity over the last 15 years of helping shape this program with very, very talented designers within my college and across the country and the world to have a front row seat to a practice and a set of pathways and careers that are rapidly evolving as we confront a lot of uncertainty in the world today. And part of that front row seat opportunity, with that comes great responsibility, in my view, and it's been part of that calling that inspired this idea of the Leap Dialogues book. It was first a symposium a few years ago, and then the opportunity to bring together some of these cutting-edge voices of a couple of them on the panel today, a couple of them in the audience tonight, together in conversation to kind of give us some insight about this work that is very meaningful, emergent, and I believe more and more consequential as we move forward in our society. This has been a collective effort putting together this book, and for it, I could not have asked more committed and inspiring colleagues to be my peers on the editorial team to bring these voices together. And so I want to honor Brian Boyer, Andrew Shea, two of our co-editors who are not here tonight, Jennifer May, our managing editor, who is here tonight, and also the director of Designmatters, and of course the exquisite Liz Danzico, who has been masterminding this panel and this event tonight. And I want to say again thanks to her, to Tom, and to the team at NPR Digital Media for welcoming us here. So with that, my pleasure to pass it on to her and the panel. Thank you.
Thanks, Mariana, and thanks, Tom, for welcoming us here, to digital media folks who have helped put this together, and to you all, who I'm so curious to get to know better a little bit during this event and after. And last but not least, Art Center, Designmatters at Art Center, our co-presenter. Thanks to all. So before we get started, because we haven't gotten started yet, believe it or not, I'd like you just to take a minute, 60 seconds, and find the person next to you, or for some people, a person next to you, and turn to that person and let that person know a pivotal moment in your career, one turning point in your vast, serendipitous, circuitous path. What is one moment that you can share with someone else in 60 seconds? Okay, go. Okay, you want to finish up? I see my NPR colleagues talking with authors from the book. I see people from journalism and design talking to pure designers. So there's a lot of mixed audience here tonight. And the point is, we have all, no matter how desperately we try to plan, have found ourselves in this place. And we probably didn't plan it. As much as we think and we're thoughtful about our careers and we try to do work that matters, we don't really know how we got here. Even if we can name that pivotal moment, there's a lot of well, and then, and except, and thankful to these 8 people. The path to doing work that we love and work that matters is often unexpected and hard to discern. And so part of tonight is to try to call out how some of that work has happened and how some of this important work is taking place. As Tom mentioned here at NPR, this is very close to our mission, getting together conversations, thinking about how to create a more informed public together with our member stations all across the country and our 17 bureaus internationally. And so we're just absolutely delighted to host this conversation, to talk more about how this work might happen. In that spirit, we've brought together some guests who I'll introduce in just a few seconds, who have taken unexpected career paths themselves and who are today doing very different and very interesting work that matters. And I just think it's worth calling out that I would be surprised if most of us in this room are designing a sort of thing anymore. And I think it's kind of been a transition that design has taken on, that we are designing opportunities for change and pathways for change rather than things that change, right? And so I think that conversation becomes more and more complex, and why it's just more important to hear from these folks this evening. So before I introduce them, just a few notes. This is being recorded. And we will open it up for questions later, which means you will be recorded. So just keep that in mind. We also have a remote listening audience here with us tonight. They can't see me, but they are going to be chiming in with questions later on when we open it up for questions towards the end. This is a conversation based on the book Mariana just so brilliantly introduced, and we will show images from that book, but it isn't about the book. The book is an instigator and a provocateur of a larger conversation that needed to happen, and this is one stop that the book is going to make and has been making all across the country. So, I'm Liz Danzico, and I'm here at NPR, and I get the pleasure of overseeing design for NPR. And I'm thrilled to introduce a panel of amazing people. So first, Mari Nakano, if you would come up and take a seat anywhere to the right over there. And Mari's design sort of thinks about the scale, the importance, and the opportunities for change in her very simple organization. She works for UNICEF, and she's in the Office of Innovation there, where she's an interaction designer and a visual designer in New York City. And she has somewhat formal training in this very topic, so I'm really excited to have her on the panel as one of the few people who have kind of gone through training in social impact design, social innovation. Next, I'd like to introduce Molly Ruskin. I would like to also say, before she even takes the stage, that Molly is participating in her personal capacity tonight. She is not saying anything on behalf of any administration she may be part of. We are in Washington, D.C., after all. And so if you've ever been frustrated or delighted about a government service, you may have Molly to thank or complain to. She has big plans at this precipitous time in our nation's history for government services. She is a designer, and the founding member of the United States Digital Service, or USDS, here in Washington, D.C., and she splits her time between New York and D.C. In New York, she too had a bit of training in social impact design in a program, so a second member of that particular cohort. And we're just delighted you can be here. And last, joining us tonight, Jen Brandel. Jen comes to us from Chicago and the road, where she spends a lot of time talking about her particular career path. You may know her from her early days, say 2006, in which she developed Dance Dance Party Party, which was a framework for women to exercise independent of instruction and free from, I see some nodding heads, nice, so free from kind of oversight, and to play music really loudly and to do this on her own. These days, she's better known as CEO and founder of Harkin, which she will tell us a lot about, and her long career in journalism. So, without further ado, we are going to commence this panel, but I would like to say that we are hosting this at NPR, and these particular careers we've selected because they have such resonance with public media. So how many people in the audience are working in public media in particular? Okay, maybe 10 to 15%, just roughly guessing. And so we all come from different fields, but like for us in public media, these three individuals are quite relevant in the work that they do. They're doing social impact work like we believe we are trying to do here at NPR. They are all public servants in some capacity, and they're serving the public through audience engagement. They've all transitioned in their careers in fairly interesting ways. They all feel this like deep resonance or deep empathy with audiences, and they use storytelling to connect with those audiences in some way. And they're sort of relentlessly passionate about what they do. So all those things are very close to our hearts here, and so I'm excited to begin the conversation. I'm going to sit down, but as I do, Jennifer, I'd love to start with your early career, if you don't mind, and then we'll venture off in different directions. And as far as I can tell, you've been doing a lot of different things, not just Dance Dance Party Party, but you started in journalism in the 2000s, right? You've kind of grown up in the journalism community, and now you're an entrepreneur who does arguably social innovation work. Can you tell us how that path happened? Was it intentional?
intentional only insofar as curiosity has kind of been my guiding force in life. So actually I found, thanks to the Wayback Machine, if you guys have ever looked at your early internet selves and shuddered, I got to do that recently for a project. But I realized on my website, when I even started in journalism, I wrote curiosity is what I believe in. I don't even have a beat. I'm just curious about pretty much everything. And that's been the way that I've kind of lived my life, is that I don't feel physically able to do things that I'm not naturally curious about. So that's led me to doing things like picking grapes in Tasmania, writing psychometric tests in Montreal, ghostwriting for burlesque dancers, ghostwriting for the late John Hughes, writing and producing videos for the Baha'i Faith. So all kinds of really random things. And then into journalism in kind of the early 2000s at WBEZ in Chicago as a radio reporter.
Fantastic. And what is it that you're doing now?
What is Hearken? Oh man. So Hearken is really, the company I run is basically a philosophy company that comes with a technology to support it. And it's the idea of bringing the audience into the equation of reporting way before publication or broadcast. Because the way that the design of journalism is now, reporters, producers, editors make decisions on behalf of the audience. They create content, then they put it out in the world, and they hope that it's relevant and it resonates. And my big question was, why can't we know before we do the expensive part of working and figure out how to make really relevant content before we do the investment of making it. And so Hearken is a way of bringing the audience into this engagement at the very outset and working with them at different touch points in the editorial process so that you make really original, relevant, and high-performing content.
Right. So imagine, as we move into the conversation stage, this design that Mara, you was inspired by you. I have read that like the evolution in Jen's career, you've said that being a designer is a never-ending process. And I'd love to hear more about that perspective that you have. And also, are you still in transition? Are you still a work in progress?
Definitely. I think for me, I was trying to actually tell Molly a little bit about when you had asked that question to everybody about what's that kind of pivot point. And I was just about to go into saying that I think, I didn't start off as a designer. I started off more or less as a social activist, but at the same time, I don't want to disregard that. I really feel like that curiosity or that creativity is something a bit innate. I was born into that. I was born into a family or born to a father who was a sushi chef, that kind of thing. And so it was to cook or to create or to make or to fix things was always part of my life. But I was a youth service coordinator, and I was working with kids to, in after school programs to do grant writing, all those kinds of things. But it was that one moment where, you're there and you're working with these kids and they're coming up to you and saying, I don't know what you're supposed to wear for an interview, or how I'm supposed to act. Like, when I take this extra course at this college, like, what am I supposed to do? Or I like photography, but I don't have money to own a camera, that kind of thing. And those moments, I said, you know what, I'm going back to school. And I think that's when I said, this is a time for me to depart more from that social services sort of space. And it's time for me to go back to school because I want to teach better. I want to be able to enable other people who are curious the way my family has allowed me to. And I think that's kind of how I came about into becoming a designer. And, long story short, ended up at UNICEF somehow,
And Molly, I have read that you used to be at a service design firm called Reboot, and it was there. Anyone from Reboot here? Anyone? So it was there that someone introduced you to the idea of being a Presidential Innovation Fellow, and that may or may not have influenced where you are today. Can you talk about that kind of pivot point and that spark that led you to where you are today?
Yeah, absolutely. I actually think it goes back before that. Much sort of like Mari's story, I started not in anywhere near design whatsoever and sort of never thought I'd really end up here. I was doing sort of organizing and activism work. I registered voters. I was working on advocacy campaigns. I worked in a state legislature, very sort of like, marching in the street, flipping tables kind of thing. And I found myself, after a couple years of that, while very passionate, very dedicated to those issues, the way that I always kind of felt about it was that I felt like I was a square peg in a round hole. I fit in the hole, but there was something missing around me. I knew this was the kind of work that I was supposed to be doing, but the day-to-day didn't feel right. There was something about that creativity that was always part of my upbringing and my childhood that had been missing. And through a lot of, I don't know, how do we ever figure out when we're supposed to transition careers? I don't know. Self-reflection and sort of exploring the little daily things that actually brought me joy. I sort of stumbled upon design, which my mother, who's in the audience tonight, hi Mom, will appreciate because she was a designer and I think probably saw that coming for a long time. And when I had sort of gone through that transition and was working at Reboot, I never in my wildest dreams, after having worked inside of the machine of politics and government, ever would have thought I'd find myself back there again. Particularly had never imagined that there would be a role for someone doing something more creative. And so when the Presidential Innovation Fellowship came along, which seemed like a pipe dream and a crazy idea, I thought, wow, this is like this incredible confluence of the things that I've been working on in different parts of my life. Impact at scale, sort of design for good, and this kind of weird, nerdy obsession with the way that our democracy and government works. So it kind of opened up a million doors that I never would have expected from there.
Jen, were you an activist at some point? It seems to be a pattern, just out of curiosity.
I actually was self-conscious that I wasn't out in the streets because a lot of my friends were, and I went to University of Wisconsin-Madison, which is a pretty well-known active school. So I think what I realized, and I worked for the Baha'i Faith for a little while, and one of the things that they, as a faith group, although I'm not a member, I have a lot of admiration for their philosophy, and Harkin is actually based in part on the Baha'i philosophy. But long story short is that their whole thing is you can fight what is and try and fix what's broken, or you can build the next thing that you think might be a good solution to what's broken. And so I've been really trying to pursue the path of building the other thing for when that other thing breaks, like what's another option. Not that it's going to work, but I found that's where I feel excited.
Great. I want to turn our attention just briefly back to public media for a moment in the intersection with social impact work. Right now, public media, and I think media in general, is experimenting and exploring ways of connecting with audiences, right? Engagement is something that we think a lot about, and it requires us to oftentimes convince or articulate things to our colleagues that we may not they may not be excited about, we'll just say. And so I'm curious, just if you could talk, Jen, about this particular process. I understand that I have researched that hearken means to listen attentively, which I think is such an important characteristic of design, and this kind of design work is to be empathetic, right, with your audience and understand. And it may be able to split into two parts, right?
Oh, yeah.
Hear and Ken. So you can, I'd love to hear about that. And how you are able to pitch hearken to newsrooms and to audiences. How do you connect with people so that they can listen?
Yeah, so the word hearken we ended up choosing because it means to listen, and then if you spell it the archaic way, because you can spell it H-A-R or H-E-A-R, and we picked H-E-A-R because you can split it up into two words, hear, which is also kind of listen, and ken means to expand your range of knowledge. So like the saying, it's out of my ken, it's out of my range of knowledge. So listen to expand your range of knowledge. Felt very tidy. I'm a design nerd, even though I don't actually like practice it. I love fonts and colors and typography and systems and frameworks. But in terms of pitching it to newsrooms, I think it's lucky that we're in a crisis moment right now. I don't think people would necessarily be listening to us if they didn't have to figure out how to engage audiences. I think we're at a particularly pressing moment for trying to figure out how to survive. Our business models are breaking. And so I think a lot of newsrooms are open to experimentation in a way that they haven't been before. And so we talk to a lot of newsrooms about why they should listen first. And we frequently run into this idea of why would we listen to our audiences? Because the newsroom only sees audiences in the comments section and when they're complaining. So I think a lot of journalists and news organizations feel like audiences are mean and maybe jerks or maybe dumb. I don't know, not nice things. And so we'll sometimes run into that person in the newsroom who's like, listen, get closer to our audience. Like, they're a bunch of assholes. Why would we want to do that? And so we have to constantly show the shining example of the audience and how amazing they are if you interact with them in a different way. It's just the spaces that we've designed to allow them to interact with us have been poorly designed. And so we only see negative impact, just like, you know, Lord of the Flies, you put these nice kids on an island and look what happens. So you need to design better, you know, situations for them to shine and do a lot more than you can give them credit for in the comments section.
Great. And Molly, I'd be curious to hear you talk about what you describe as the work that you do as being more organizational change. It sounds to me that's a lot of listening and very similar to what Jen's talking about, and that the work that you do, you have said, is to make things feel tangible such that you can be not only empathetic, but also kind of connect with audiences who might not understand the things that you're trying to present. Is that the case? And if so, can you talk more about what you mean by organizational design?
Yeah, it was really interesting to hear you talk about that. I've often thought that there's a number of parallels in the challenges that we face in terms of sort of transforming the way that the big old government works with other sort of large legacy organizations. And I think newsrooms have a really interesting parallel there. I think at the end of the day, our work is about growing government's capacity to deliver better programs and services and experiences for people, not just to ship and fix one specific service here and there. Obviously, we are trying to make real, tangible change that affects people in their daily lives. But at the end of the day, like the organization that I work for and sort of all the little groups that have sprung up around the country, we're just sort of a bit of a catalyst to sort of support the movement and energy that's already going on. And so if we go into a corner and do our good little human-centered design work and ship a beautiful product, that helps in the short term, but it doesn't help in the long term. It doesn't help with the bigger picture problems, which is the incentive structures, the sort of mechanisms that keep government from being able to do this work more effectively over time. So much of it is about bringing people into the fold, understanding what the real limitations on them are, hearing that, being empathetic to that, giving them the opportunity to see and be open to how what we can do as designers and as technologists and creative thinkers can sort of transform how they work. And that really does end up meaningfully changing their like business processes and sort of the culture that they work in. So it seems like it's about, you know, a website with pretty colors or nice buttons, but it's about much, much more behind the scenes.
Yeah, it seemed to me by researching Mari's work a little bit, you knew this was coming, that, we have this book that maybe you saw in the lobby, and I was sort of doing a little data analysis on the book, and your particular section, the word articulate came up many, many, many times in a section about what you do, which made me think you could describe the work that you do in many ways, but that particular word kept coming up again and again. Why is that? What is happening with the work that you do that part of your job seems centrally about communicating the value of your work?
A lot of times I'll talk to other designers, and it's a lot about, so what do we need to be in this type of space? Is it just looking good? You know what I mean? And that's part of the way to get in, right? When you see something visually appealing, there builds a competency immediately because you see that. But when the thing is, I think a lot of designers and artists tend to be introverts, and but what we need to work on is being more verbally articulate as well. It's really important for us not only to show the stories that we need to tell on behalf of the organizations that we work for, but it's really important for us to let people know the our intelligence capacity, even, you know, of what we can do, how we're thinking, and that we do really understand the programs or the type of problems that our organizations are struggling with, and that we too can sit there and not just sit back and say, hey, look at this really awesome deck or infographic that I made, but be part of that conversation. And so we start to be able to insert ourselves at that level now, instead of being, you know, a receded type of character as part in that team. So it's really important for us to be embedded and integrated and articulating ourselves in more than just visuals but words, and the way we speak about what we do and why we do it, and the value of why design matters in a social innovation space is extremely important. So I'm always about, you know, advocating for that kind of thing, and you know, I continue to have to work on that myself. Yeah.
Yeah, great. We're all serving the public in some way, and part of that, I'm glad you brought up storytelling. I mean, part of that is like storytelling and directly engaging with audiences to understand different points of view. And I'd like to hear a few stories from you about the ways in which in your work you engage directly with audience, a person, a cohort, a community, yeah, just kind of a specific example or a story about how that connection to audience takes place. Molly, you're the researcher really in the group, and so I'm wondering if that.
Else go first.
No, anyone can.
Well, sort of, I'll give you sort of the background of kind of how we're doing that big picture, and while I try to come up with some cool stories. So much of what we're doing in the federal space right now, and it's also happening in the local government, is to help agencies understand how to bring the experiences of people into the way that they do business. So it is user-centered design, human-centered design, sort of 101. And so we are trying to demystify, simplify, and make it as easy as possible for the people who are designing and building programs and services to connect directly with users and get out in the world, get out of the building. So we try to prototype things really fast, get it in front of people very quickly, get feedback, iterate, do that process, and include our partners inside of government as much as possible. We also, when time and space allow, try to invest in sort of the discovery, the need finding phase, where we're saying we have a lot of assumptions about the experiences that people are having. Let's go out and learn from their perspective what they're feeling and seeing right now. And so there have been a number of really cool efforts in different organizations in the federal and local governments to sort of do deeper sort of ethnographic and user-centered design studies. There's a story that I've told a couple different times from when I was doing work with the Department of Veterans Affairs, which is when I was in that fellowship program. There's just a woman whose story, for some reason, really is powerful and resonates with me. She was actually a friend of mine. She was an Army veteran, young Latina mother living in Chicago, single mom living at home with her family, had this very sweet little girl who was literally wearing a tutu and jumping around on a plastic covered couch when I went to her house. And she described very viscerally the experience that she felt when she walked into a VA hospital. She felt like, this place is not for me. It reminds me of skeletons. It reminds me of hard things. It feels like it's for guys. It was this very tangible language that she was able to communicate that really resonated. And she had a really powerful story, which I was able to take back and communicate what sort of broke through this idea of particularly an organization like the VA, which is made up of people who have also served. They say, oh, well, we're veterans, so we know everything about this. But when you're outside of those silos, it's easy to forget what it feels like. And essentially, she was using the VA's GI Bill to help her pay for school. And she had moved, which is an incredibly common thing that young people do. And the VA did not update her email, her address, and her school did not update her address. And a couple of years later, her credit got hit really, really hard, and debt collectors have been calling her and trying to reach her at her old address because she'd missed a bill payment. And this is a very simple, from sort of a digital design perspective, it's a very simple feature on a website that wasn't there. But it's multiplied sort of from a service design perspective of she couldn't reach anybody on the phone. She was feeling uncomfortable going into a facility. So this one particular story really helped us understand and see all the different ways this complex organization was adding strain to somebody's life. But she's also really inspiring because she stuck with the programs, and she said, once you get through the process, it's really worth it, and I love my VA benefits. And there's sort of it adds a good human face to the point of why we're doing these processes.
I guess I got one. I think I'll talk about a small story about a product called U-Report that UNICEF Innovation has scaled. It's a platform that's a free SMS-based text messaging system where youth can join in. They can text for free in their country. And then what happens is a text flow can begin. They can get surveyed every week, either a UNICEF country office, the government, a local community organization can be sending these text messages into thousands of kids who have joined in that particular country to ask them multiple choice questions or to even ask them more long written form type of questions. It's scaled in 30 countries. It's actually doubled in the last year from 15 to 30. And that has a lot to do with design that I could talk about later. But I think one big case for us was in Liberia. There was this instance of, this possibility of, is there an issue with sex for grades? So what happened was we deployed this question on this platform and text about 13 to 14,000 youth and said, is sex for grades a problem? And within 24 hours, 86%, both men and female and male responded, yes, there is a problem. And because the data is coming back in real time, it's being shown in a transparent space, government have to respond. You can't ignore that when 86% of your kids are saying this is an issue. Hotlines were set up within the first 2 days. Those things broke basically because so many kids had been calling in to figure out what they can do. And so now we're working with the Ministry of Education and the Ministry of Gender to implement more ways to really tackle this issue. For me, from a design perspective, our team is really in charge of deploying that brand. Every time a country wants to deploy U-Report, we get a call basically from the deployment specialist saying this needs to go up within a week. But we've set up a design deployment type toolkit where literally one designer on the team can get a logo, get a site, get the images up online, maybe deployed in a week, so we can do immediate response. For me, and to have a story like that, to know that there's a story like that where that effect can happen within such a short amount of time, really keeps me impassioned to do what we're doing. It's really hard when you're working from New York as a designer or a design team. You don't get to interact necessarily directly with these kids, but when you see that type of response, then you have to keep going. You can't stop. That's part of your job. That's part of your life calling. So those types of stories are really inspiring. Yeah.
With Hearken, curiosity is really kind of the basis formula for all of the partners who use our philosophy and our services. So we're in about 10 countries right now. We're a pretty new company, but one of our partners here in Washington, WAMU, has a series called What's with Washington, which is a Hearken series. So they've done stuff like, why is it so loud in DC with all the sirens? Do we have more, emergencies in other cities? And, every story starts with an audience member's question, because a question is really like a big flashing arrow for an information need or desire from the audience. And so in Chicago, when I was reporting, we got, thousands and thousands of amazing questions, but one that is kind of like the pinnacle of what I was hoping would be possible with this kind of experience was this woman, Janice Thompson, was living in Europe for a while. She moved back to Chicago. And in Europe, apparently on their energy bills, there's a breakdown of how your energy got to you, how much of it was made from coal, how much from fracking, how much from wind power, something that you're like, oh, that'd be really good to know. And she wondered with Chicago's bills, it was completely opaque. So she wanted to know how much of the electricity used in the the city was begotten through fracking. So she asked us the question. We involved her along the way. She wasn't able to physically come out with us reporting, which we like to do whenever possible, but we kept her apprised of what we were finding, asked her what she thought. It's really like design thinking applied to journalism at the story level. And so what was disappointing is that we couldn't find answers for her. We did 2 stories, and the stories were really about how opaque it was and how difficult it was to find out the origin of energy, which is a problem. But we felt sad for her that we couldn't satisfy her curiosity, because that's what we purport to do. But then lo and behold, a year later, she sent us a blog post that she wrote, and we were just blown away. It was about how she quit her job in order to become an energy activist, basically, in Chicago, because she felt so heard and so valued by us, and she felt like people deserved to know where their energy came from, and that it was a big enough problem that she wanted to help spread that in the community. And so I really think this, like these terms and these things keep coming up of empathy and of curiosity and of listening. And I think listening is a profoundly healing act for people. And I think that when you listen with rapt attention, people really transform, and they're given the energy to do things that they wouldn't normally do because they felt heard. And so that's kind of, she's a shining example of what can happen when you listen and respect the audience.
Thanks. Yeah, we are going to ask you your questions in just a moment. So while you're gathering and thinking about your questions, I was curious your take on this today. We have moved from a time when if you were hiring a designer, you would look at you mentioned type and color, right, and graphics design expertise, to then digital, where you'd look at someone's maybe coding expertise and thoughts about, digital platforms. The words that you have used this evening really have very little to do with those things. And I would love to hear just a few skills that you look for or you would hope to find in future designers that you are working with or hiring. What are they?
Some that come to mind are flexibility, empathy, the ability to be incisive and think really deeply. I think it is about figuring out how people think. So whether that's exercises and having people do something unfamiliar or talk through how they solved a problem. I think, to me, designers are just brilliant thinkers in various media that is hard to always capture with a Squarespace personal website or whatever that may be. So I think learning about people's way of thinking and the fact that if they're a good listener and that they are flexible when they hear new information, they'll change.
Great. And I would like to just say these are additive skills, nothing against graphic design and coding. I think those are all skills we take with us and add these additional kind of other skills. So anything to add? Otherwise, I think I see a question.
I think it's a lot about people knowing, right? I mean, and it's hard because it's really hard to put on a job description that a highlight skill set is that you are empathetic and that you know people, and also like, how do you prove that in an interview? That that person could be in my shoes, and just not a sympathetic person, but an empathetic one. And I'll put some points to that, and it's really hard because some of these things have such nuances to them, but it's really important when, at least for us, when we're interviewing designers, you can see their skill sets, their technical skill sets quite quickly, but it's about how they talk, how they problem solve with you. And it's also about their ability to be humble, right? I think a lot of times designers get kind of defined as people who may be cocky or they're like fashionable and designy and they know everything, and they want to keep everything straight and aligned and perfect rags on their paragraphs and all those kind of things. But at the same time, it's really important to find those people who know when to step forward and put their skill set out there to beautify and highlight and uplift other people's work in a social innovation space, but know when they need to sort of recede and say, it's not my time to talk, it's my time to listen. And that's the value I'm going to give back later, for this system that we're trying to solve,
I would just add one other thing, which is I sort of circle back around something we were talking about earlier, which is the ability to speak about the work, I think, has increasing importance. I've never worked in like a normal design organization, so maybe you don't need that if you're like working in a regular design firm, but everywhere I've worked is that issue that you mentioned earlier, which is sort of relaying the value of the process and the value of the work. And even though we this evening are extremely guilty of many, many buzzwords, the ability to speak past the buzzwords and explain sort of what's behind your process in a way that someone who doesn't know anything about design can connect with is hugely valuable, and I think gonna get people much further in the growing years.
Yeah, and I think that speaks very much to the current time. I think that when industry say that, I wouldn't say this is a new field. It's not a new. I don't think any of us would say this is a new field, but there certainly is new awareness of this as a discipline and as a field. And I think it's really unique for a new field or a newly emerging field to not rely on those buzzwords and to be straightforward and to seek that authenticity that I think does not often come hand in hand with new. So that's fantastic to hear. I would love to hear from you guys questions for the panel, from anyone you've heard from. There's a microphone. Yeah.
Hi, thanks so much. My name is Carol. I love that you were talking so much about government because that's where it's kind of related to what I work on now, and it's still very unfamiliar to me. And you, Molly, you were talking about government services, designing products. I wonder if you had any perspectives on applying design to things that might be less tangible, like policy advocacy or the policymaking process itself.
How long do you have?
Um,
We could talk about this for a while, but I love it. So we sort of have a dirty secret in the day-to-day of the work that we do, which is that we feel like we are actually designing sort of the bigger picture policy by fixing buttons and fixing websites. It's very hard to wrap your hands around the big process, and I think it's like an extremely new and uncharted space that is worthy of our broad set of industries figuring out how to do better. In the meantime, I think one of the ways that we can have the most impact in sort of the bigger picture sort of shape of policy is to show what it means once a policy is passed to be implemented, which is, let me tell you, extremely unsexy, but pays my bills. So the way the thought that I have on it, you asked what my thoughts were, is how do you find ways to show people once something you're advocating for becomes law and then is enacted in the world, what does it feel like for someone to actually experience that? Because that's where we get the really tangible impact, tangible feedback on what it means for a policy to become a reality. Part of the reason I could talk about this for years, and I promise I won't, I'm sorry, I just get excited about it, is that I have had this very unusual career trajectory of being a person who advocated for policy and now sees what it's like to actually make that stuff work, the mechanism behind the scenes. And I feel strongly that there's this huge disconnect between these two spaces. I think there's work of designers and program creators and managers that organizers and advocates don't understand, and I think the flip is true also. So fix it, I don't know, figure out how to make it better, please. Thank you.
Great. I think there's a hand back here.
Well, thank you. First of all, congratulations for the tremendous work that you do. Very inspiring. I work for an international development firm, and one of the things that pops up whenever I hear all of your stories is that you work for traditionally conservative institutions like the UN, the federal government, like an industry that refuses, for the most part, to hear to their audiences. So I wanted to get your thoughts on how to combat that. Like, I know you have like a rebellious spirit that has driven that, and I really appreciate that. And in an industry or like a field of international development, we often see that the biggest innovations come from very grassroots movements, but we want to bring that to a bigger scale. So I wanted to get your thoughts on on how to bridge those, like grassroots initiatives that actually come from the communities that need an improvement in their services and in their quality of life, with the big scale.
Okay. You know, a favorite thing is like this organizational change work, I think, you know. For UNICEF Innovation, UNICEF has been trying to be innovative for the 70 years that it has existed. But, you know, over time, when you work in an organization that has 12,000 plus people, it gets really hard to share that anymore, right? And so you need that young blood to come in, or these fresh mindsets to be in these organizations. And I think for us, a simple way is just pure existence. And going back to that whole when you're forward and when you're receding, it plays into that. Our team really, our lead is 35 years old, and everybody on the team is in their mid 20s, early 30s, that kind of thing, which is really fun. But at the same time, we're often looked at as like the black sheep of the organization. We don't wear suits. People wear jeans and slippers and things like that to work. But we try to design an open space. That's one way where we just put like any designer does, slap Post-its on the wall, slap our sketches of the ideas that we're prototyping on the wall, and we always really try to invite people to come and to look, and so we can share those stories, invite them to sit and be with us. So it's half of that. It's half of us also just prototyping what we think could work for the larger organization within ourselves, so we can fail in a safe space and risk take for us and start to see, well, is this thing applicable for HR? Is this thing that we're doing applicable for this other program division? Perhaps. Let's share that with them. Let's not put that on them, but let's just let them know what we're working on and why that's effective for the small spaces that we're working in, and hopefully they'll pick up and take ownership of those type of things. So it's a lot about that. Yeah.
And I would just add to that in terms of what we found so far, because we're working with some really big media organizations that are giant institutions like the BBC, who are, you know, very old and huge. And I think what we're learning is that everything is bottom up. So it's grassroots from the audience, and then it's grassroots within the newsroom as well. So how do you find the person with the sparkle in their eye who's really excited about this thing, and then figure out how to empower them to then sell it to their bosses, to then sell it to their bosses, to then sell it to their bosses. So that's been our approach so far, is to just create arguments up the value chain to allow the person who's going to do the work to get that protected space to do the work. It's really hard, but we just have tried top down, and that never works for us so far.
I think there's a really interesting sort of conversation that I've observed over the last couple of years in, I think, particularly large organizations, though maybe multiple different sizes, which is is it work better if you create a special group and call it the innovation group or the special design group or whatever, or do you try to like sort of spread that throughout? And I've been exposed to both, though I think there's a natural gravitation to the first one, because it's like, well, we're all dressed the same. Like, oh, I know how to do things with these people. Like, we'll go off and we'll do some stuff together, and then we'll figure out how to talk to the other people. And in full disclosure, that's kind of the way that much of the work that's happened in the federal government has gone. And I think the challenge is that you're perceived as other. And you're perceived, particularly this like young hip thing, is like, oh, you're the kids. Like, don't tell us how to do our jobs. We've literally been doing this for 30 years. We know a lot more about it than you, which is also true. And so it's an interesting tension, though, of also making sure you're building in, if you have efforts that are successful sort of at the grassroots, they are able to sort of create infrastructure and support around them so that they can get up. I know I'm not really answering your question, being quite vague, but I think where I've seen it most successful is when there's this kind of mirroring of excitement from the top and open-mindedness to doing things differently, and some dedication and hard work that happens from some people down here, and sometimes it's a group and sometimes it's a few. And unfortunately, there isn't a formula yet. Maybe that's a good thing.
We have time for one more question. Here in the front.
Hi. When people talk about design and innovation and technology, there's such a focus on the new and what's next. And I've seen a lot of challenges in how do we learn from those who came before us, where technology might not learn from how libraries have been organizing information, or there's community advocacy groups and those who've been doing the work on the ground for sometimes decades. How do we learn from those who came before us and integrate that when people are talking about design, innovation, and the future?
$10 million question. I feel like interdisciplinaryism is something that people are starting to look to more, think of more, but there's so much. I mean, even having some conversations in the building today, here at NPR, people were saying how they were talking to museum groups and they were having similar problems as, journalists are having with connecting and engaging with their audiences, and governments are, and, organizations. So I think there's so much to be learned from cross-pollinating with one another and learning what worked in 1960. Maybe it didn't fully work then, but now because we have the internet, it can work again. Let's try it again. But I don't know, do you have ideas for how to start to thread that in more regularly?
I'm going to break my buzzword rule. And I hate that I'm about to do this, but I think it's about spending time with and building empathy for the people who've come before. This is like an incredibly relevant and daily part of the work that we do. And I think many groups who have this kind of like large institution and we're trying to bring something new is to really not just see and hear what people's lives are like, but try to really understand why it is that things like this haven't existed before. What are sort of the incentives? What are the barriers? What are the motivators that have kind of enabled or prohibited the kind of work you're trying to do? And also, I think it takes a very creative lens to see how other people have in fact been doing this work. One of my colleagues, who I know is a friend of Liz's also, Dana Chisnell, gives this great talk about all of the people she's met in her career as a designer who are designers, but who would never call themselves that, right? Who are creating programs, or who are fixing websites, or who are redesigning words on a paper form. And they're doing the work of design, but they don't use the same terminology as us. So it takes that kind of dedicated focus to listen and hear that. And it's easy to sit up on this stage and say that. It's actually very, very difficult in your day-to-day, like shipping your stuff, your sprints, your pixels and all that, to figure out how to actually sit and listen and hear people. It's something I think I'm always needing to be better at.
Great. So I have one last question for you before we depart, and that is, there's a lot of people in this room, I suspect, I don't know, but I suspect a lot of people in this room who would love to do more work in this space. Some may be curious about leaving their jobs and starting to do this work, but others just want to do this work in place. Can you give just a brief couple of examples of how people and where people can do this work? And just give you a couple of examples. We have at least a couple of Code for America former fellows, alumni in the room, Presidential Innovation Fellow. Those are commitments that are long-term. So are there other examples like that, or even just small things that we can do individually where we are?
I think for UNICEF, it's so big, but at the same time, we're really, at least for the design team, it's not on our job description, but it's our underlying like rebellious cause to really try to figure out new ways to embed designers and bring them in. Some of it's just, it's not about looking for the specific job, because a lot of times UNICEF's not going to be writing the perfect job description for you. It's about actually going in and telling them what you want to do, what kind of problems you want to solve, and understanding that organization and saying, hey, this is the type of skill set I have and I want to give that. How can I be involved? And honestly, like at least for our team, we've had a lot of these type of cold callers who will come in, but it's part of our culture to really take a look and assess and say, this person needs to be in here. How do we get them in here? How do we develop research work or if there's research work or projects that we can match them to, we'll find a way to bring them in. So I would say to any of you, if that's what you want to do, just put yourself out there and tell people what you want to do. Do the whole field of dreams of like, if you build it, they will come, you know, that kind of feeling. I think it's going to take a little bit of that for a while. And then, you know, it's going to start to flip. I think that these organizations are starting to really try to figure out how to create these spaces for people. But in the meantime, it's going to be a lot about us trying to tell people what we'd like to give back to these organizations.
Yeah, I think one, in addition to that, and I love that idea of just being bold and telling the person who might be your superior or close of what your big, bold, hairy idea is and see what they think. And if they don't like it, try another person and see if you can find that person who will enable you to spend some time doing that. The other thing I look for and encourage other folks to do is to find other kind of yay sayers in your organization. So other people who have that spark or are interested in trying something new and just building like a coalition of the quote unquote willing, the people who want to try something else, and whether it's getting together after hours or, you know, taking a little bit of time in a meeting to say, well, what if we did it this way, or how might we do X? And just trying to build a group of people who are willing to experiment and take risks, and then building some support structure around that if you can.
Yeah.
I have two concrete thoughts on this. One has to do with my job, which is that we're always hiring, and you should all come work for us. A number of my colleagues are here tonight. The U.S. Digital Service, the Presidential Innovation Fellows, 18F, there's a number of different groups inside the federal government. You mentioned Code for America. There's sort of this burgeoning growth of opportunities to bring all the skill sets that you have to your local or federal government. So definitely explore all of that. Come harangue us afterwards, and we'll tell you URLs and all that good stuff.
I'm sorry, Adam, just a quick question. I mean, given what you just said, what happens in the next administration, whoever it becomes, to these agencies like 18F, USDS?
Yeah, it's a great question. We get asked that. No, you're fine. It's a good question. It happens. We get asked that on a regular basis.
Repeat that question.
Sure. The question was, what happens to the federal digital design organizations with the change of the administration? So a number of the organizations are basically baked into the federal agencies at this point. So 18F in particular they kind of have like a fee-for-service model. They're like a consulting group inside of the federal government. So their work is very much not it's not administration driven. It's sort of a demand from other agencies. The U.S. Digital Service, while we do work closely and are sort of a part of the administration, we're now also sort of baked into the infrastructure of the White House organization. So we'll continue to exist in the next administration in whatever form that takes. And a number of the other efforts are sort of different entities within different federal agencies, and so they'll become a part of that culture moving forward. Obviously, there's big questions about, there's sort of two different futures, and one we have bigger things to worry about. Just leave that out there. Sorry. So the other direction is that, speaking of the election and sort of speaking of this moment, I think that right now there is sort of social change and movement building around the country happening in so many new and exciting and incredible ways. And if you're looking for something to do that doesn't involve changing your career at the moment or leaving your job, there's an immense, I feel like I wish I were sort of starting out in my design career at this moment, because between the sort of number of incredible local groups sprouting up as part of Black Lives Matter, or people registering voters or getting engaged sort of in their local government, there's just a huge need for the way that you all think and act and do. And everything from sort of like how people are organizing for fair housing, people need flyers, they need websites, like all of the things that you do in the traditional design sense, to the strategy and the sort of design thinking side. So like to answer that question, I would say get super local. Like every nonprofit does not have the money to hire all of us, and spending some of your free time improving your skills and also connecting to people in your community is going to be a huge sort of boon both for your career and for the space that you take up.
Fantastic way to end. NPR is also hiring. Just keep that in mind. No, we're hiring on a regular basis. But fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing the thoughts and for being here. And I wanted to mention that it's not about this book, and this is not a book plug per se, but the book itself, which I have like dog-eared and carry around with me, is for sale on Amazon, and there are some copies out in the lobby. It won some design awards. So it's pretty as well, but mostly the stories in it, we've been very kind of agreeable this evening, I guess, and the stories in it kind of conflict with one another, and there's an amazing diversity of perspective, points of view, use cases, and visual examples. So it's a good thing to pick up if this is a conversation you want to continue to keep going. But tonight, that concludes our event. Thank you so much for coming. We'll be around for a little bit afterwards and would love to continue the conversation. Thanks.